Hello, everybody. We are going to be working on Unit 2 tonight. Unit two's topic is controllers, so I'm going to navigate us there in the course show. The main thrust of what we're doing here is learning about one of the major components of MVC, that being controllers. And arguably, in many ways, controllers might be one of the most important parts of the whole architecture. I'm going to be bringing our book up onto screen here, and I hope you have your book handy as we go through. The document is kind of a combination of kind of information and exercise at this point in the book. So there are some step-by-step things that you need to do. Sometimes the book doesn't really highlight them as clearly as they should be. And I've been taking notes as I go through this, so I have some highlights that I'll be pointing out as we go through. But for right now, let's jump into the chapter and get rolling here. All right, so we've talked last week, and I probably mentioned this, that we talk about when we build an application using ASP.NET, and we talk about the tools that we use to both deliver the applications, create them, and then actually utilize the content. And of course, when we do ASP.NET, really our output mechanism is the browser. Right? The browser runs on the hypertext transfer protocol. We are using HTML5 as kind of our given engine these days, but HTTP is what we call a stateless protocol, meaning it lacks certain functionality that is integral to an operating system, which is more of a normal environment for generating an application. So we are going to learn about this construct within MVC called controller, which for me, I'd like to think of it as kind of like the gatekeeper, or perhaps the conductor of the orchestra for an application. Because nothing happens in an application in MVC without it first going through the controller. The controller controls the flow of how the application works. It sometimes has programming logic built into it. It sometimes interfaces with data, and sometimes utilizes a host of other tools in order to get the work done. All right. They have a little blurb here that talks about the history of controllers, and really what they're trying to show you is some of the concepts, once again, really kind of go pretty far back. Back into an era when the concepts of GUI were completely new. I mean, we're really kind of going all the way back into the 70s. Now, for a lot of you that aren't aware, when we think of graphical user interfaces, aside from, okay, I mean, I guess technically a command prompt is kind of graphical, but in the old days of computing, this is like you were happy to get this up on your screen, a command prompt. You type a command, press enter, and something happens, right? That was your interface. And really this is a console interface. It's a command line interface. Hasn't gone away, but it's still there. In the mid to late 70s, the people at Xerox came up with some revolutionary concepts. And that was the graphical user interface in a fashion that how we think of it now. And that is pictures on the screen and a mouse to move a pointer around and to be able to click on things, right? Funny thing is they never really thought it would go anywhere. Which is, oops, mistake, right? But they were the ones that kind of originally propelled this concept. And then others started to see what they were doing and then develop their own versions. Most notably, in that era, late 70s and then going into the early 80s, the people at Apple Computer caught onto this concept of the graphical user interface and then created the Mac OS, which was released in '84, beginning of '84. And then, of course, the PC side of things was always kind of chasing them because they really kind of led the way that way. And eventually, by the time we got into the 90s, most consumer operating systems, in fact, most computers in general, had a graphical user interface that we know in a lot of ways. Graphical user interfaces really kind of require a lot of the architecture that we're using. And what they're indicating here in this blurb is how the people back then had the conception that we need some sort of a control mechanism within an application to kind of direct things before we can show the user what's next. You know, so if you're clicking on a button expecting something to happen, something's got to orchestrate what's going on behind the scenes and then render a new view so you know something happened. And that concept stems a ways back. So you can read that blurb. I think it's really nicely written, but I'm not really going to spend a lot of time there. What we are going to do is we are going to take a look at this sample application. Now, one thing I do want to point out is you'll notice that there's a link right here. And I think that we talked about this a little bit last time as well. But if you want, go ahead and actually click that link and open it up, and it will take you to this website here. And you have the ability to actually download the project directly, including the tutorial that helps you build it, provided that you understand that this was written in MVC3. It looks a little bit different than what we do now. So one of my early temptations was, let's do this in MVC5, but I would have to kind of figure out all the changes that it would require. Kornika, you've done this project with me before, and it's pretty challenging. Remember, even when you follow what they're doing exactly, there's still challenges that you have to figure out because it wasn't really written like a textbook. You know, it's like somebody's, homegrown tutorial kind of thing. However, this is kind of seen as one of the preeminent examples of MVC out there that you can just download and look at the code. Because most people that build applications don't like to share stuff if they've created something really cool. They want you to buy it, right? Understandably so if you put a lot of work into something. But please feel free to explore this. And if you're interested in actually trying to build it, I did create a series of videos related to exactly the tutorial you have here using MVC3. And if I remember right, I did it on Visual Studio 2013 or 2015. And honestly, I forget, probably 2015. But you can watch the whole series of videos. I think there's like 9 or 10 videos, each about an hour long. So it's not like a short process. If you entertain doing that project, let me know. I will consider extra credit if you actually build it from scratch. Okay? Consider. I didn't say guarantee. Keep that in mind. I'd want to monitor that progress. Okay. But for sake of example, we are going to use that to look at to demonstrate some of the principles that we're going to talk about here. So this MVC music store that they have is designed to be, in essence, a complete project. And it's supposed to be a complete e-commerce project, meaning from the ground up. And they use what we call code-first techniques to create some of the database content, and then they take it from rudimentary content all the way up through functioning e-commerce. Not to the point where you're processing a credit card, but where you can put things into a shopping cart and try to check out, and you can log in, and you can administer the site, and you can be a user and save your shopping cart, and all the types of things that you're used to doing when you are, on an e-commerce application. This is kind of a screenshot of what the application looks like when it's running, and then when you have it up and running, you have the ability to, let's say, look at music in categories, and then you can kind of narrow it down and find particular albums that you might be interested in, and then of course you can go ahead and add it to your cart, go through that particular experience, then you can take a look at your shopping cart, and then go through the process of putting in payment information and personal stuff. You can also sign in as an administrator and then take any of the content that's in the application that's being pulled from the database and manipulate it. So if you want to change a price or add an image for an album or add a new album or delete an album or whatever it is, we create that whole functionality in that application as well. All right, but as we indicated, what really drives a lot of these applications are the controllers. And what we're going to look at first is what we call the home controller, which is kind of like a default construct that's available for all MVC applications. So when we created that example last week, right, and we really a matter of a few button clicks and typing in a couple of things, and then all of a sudden we had a complete website with a registration system that we could log into that we hardly had any hand coding at all. But even in a project like that, one of the default constructs is what we call the home controller. All right. Now, I'm going to just use the examples that are here in the book, knowing in the back of my head that when we do it in Visual Studio 2017, some stuff looks a little different, but I mean, in essence, it's still Visual Studio with all the same content. Now, notice what the home controller is responsible for. It says it is responsible for the home page or the root of the website. So that makes sense, right? When you learn how to create content with HTML, you learn that what is your home page? Yeah, index.html. And when you first start out, you think that every website's homepage is index.html. And you know what? If it's a static website, it must be, because that's how they operate. When we get to an MVC application, however, it doesn't work that way. The file that might be rendering your view might be called index, but not necessarily. The home controller actually intercedes and kind of directs the traffic. And whatever you see up on the screen by landing on the home page of a site isn't necessarily the index page. It might be, it might not be. It's really the result of whatever the controller tells it to be. All right, but typically the home controller is responsible for directing the traffic to whatever the home page is. And notice, by default, an about page and a contact page. Why? Because those are really common things to have on a website, especially for like any sort of business entity or organization. Another thing that comes by default very often is what we call an account controller. If we build authentication into our application like we did last week, right? We just clicked a couple buttons and allowed people to create accounts and whatever. Then you also by default get an account controller. If you skip that piece, if you don't add the ability to have accounts on the website, the account controller is not included. It is omitted. Notice the location of the controller, and I'm going to enlarge my screen here just a little bit, just so you can see this. Maybe that's one click too many. But take a look at the location of the controllers. No surprise, they're located in the controllers folder. With an MVC application, there's certain conventions. Remember this little slogan, convention over configuration? By convention, we take all of our controller files and put them in the controller folder. That way we know where to find them. Also, if I were in Visual Studio and I were to right-click on the controllers folder, one of the first possible things I could add is a new controller. And then it builds basically a C# file that looks similar to the one that we have here. But what I want you to notice as you're looking at that file are a few things. Most importantly, notice inside the class file, right around where my cursor is right now, I suppose, we have this thing that says action result index. So when somebody visits the root of the website, the home controller kicks in, and by default, it will assume you want the index method to be called, and then it will return a view. In this case, there's not really much going on because we don't have anything built, right? However, you could have some directives in here. Notice that on the About page, right, or the About method, technically, inside the controller, it is actually going to put together, well, it looks like some sort of a message. It says viewbag.message equals a string. Pretty self-explanatory. And then what that will do when it does the return view is it will take that message and, of course, as plain text, put it up on the screen. It's pretty simplistic. Similar construct for contact. Now, this is all handled by the home controller. The default action for the home controller is the index method. So if I go to the root of the website, that's the one that will launch. All right. Now, what we're going to do right now is I would like you guys to go back, and I want you to open up the application that we created last week. All right? So let's go ahead and do that. Now, typically, I will lecture you on making a version of your work, but you guys should have had me in class enough now where you should know that if you're going to work on a thing and continue it, that you should probably make a copy of it first before you continue it. That way, if you screw it up, you can go back to the copy you had before. If you've already turned your work in, I guess you can probably go with the peace of mind that I have a copy of it so you don't lose it. But really the good practice you should be in is either to use some sort of versioning control software like GitHub or Bitbucket or whatnot, or manually make copies of your work before you proceed. All right. So here's what I would like to do. I would like to find in Visual Studio, which I do have open right here. I'm going to go to my open dialog, and actually I'm going to come down here to Recent Projects and Solutions. And what I'm looking for is the work that I created last week. And I believe it's this one right here on my list. It might not be the same on yours. I know that I was tinkering with the music store, so entries 1 and 2 are those. If you remember exactly where you placed your work, you might want to manually go into the folder. And of course, I have mine on my other screen here. So in my OneDrive here, I know that I created, well, I'd better check this by date, right? That's it. That's the part that always gets you here. You gotta check those dates. I better sort by name rather than date. But I did create the MVC Music Store right here. So you see 9/11/2018. And if you want to open it up that way, you can do it that way. Of course, you'd have to go into your project, find the solution file, and open it. So that's what I'm going to do. And the reason we're doing this is we kind of have like a structure already going, right? So I could have you recreate those steps, but trust me, we'll get a lot of practice as we go through the semester. And right now, it's really more about kind of seeing how things work more than anything else. I'm going to begin by actually closing this superfluous, I guess, extra version of Visual Studio that's open. And I don't know if you guys realize you can have multiple versions of it open at the same time, which can get a little confusing. But here is the one that we built last time. I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button just to run it, just to kind of refresh what it looked like and what it did, and just to make sure it's working before I actually go ahead and do anything to it. So I would encourage you guys to do the same thing. And of course, here it is on my other screen. There it is. And, you know, gosh, I don't remember what my login was. Maybe Google will remember for me. I have no clue what my password was, honestly. But there it is. And does that ring a bell at least, right? You guys are all okay. So, and the fact that it's working is helpful too, because that way when we go into the application and we make some adjustments, we know at least it was working to begin with. See my rationale? All right, so let's go back to the book. And what I'll do here is I'm actually going to move this off to the second screen so I can work cleanly on this screen. All right. The first step that they want us to accomplish, so we are at the bottom of page 39 right now, step 1. It says, replace your application description page, in quotes, in the about method with a phrase of your choice. Perhaps, I like cake. Okay, so that sounds pretty silly. But first we have to find the file that they're pointing to. What file were they pointing to? The home controller, right? Where are the controllers found? In the controllers folder. So easy enough. So click the home controller. And what they want us to do here is come down to the about method and change this text. So put in something else. Since we happen to have Kringle in the classroom tonight, really it depends on the flavor for me. I like, the pecan and the almond probably the best. All right, so if you've done that change, go ahead and do a Control S to save, and then hit the button. Start the application running. And once again, they seem to want to come up on my second screen, probably just because it's there. So we'll let the application launch again. All right, and there it is. And how am I going to see the results of what I just did? Go to About, right, because really what we need to do is actually navigate to that page. But one way we can do it, obviously, is we can just click About, right? Or knowing the name of your controller and then knowing the name of your method. And this is a really critical concept, you guys. One that you guys should not miss coming out of this course. Notice the URL. I clicked on About. In a standard HTML application, even an ASPX application, if you click on a page, if I clicked on About, it probably would bring up about.aspx or about.html, right? Here, it almost looks like that URL is pointing us to the home folder and then to the About folder where there might be an index page. Not at all the case. What that URL refers to is, first of all, that this is being pulled up by virtue of going to the home controller and then finding the About method. So really the URL functionally is a call to a controller file first, and then to a method within the controller. You guys see that? So if I had a method inside my home controller called, Kringle, and I clicked on my Kringle link, it would take me to home/Kringle. Notice the clean URLs has nothing to do with the file structure underneath. This is a typical controller pattern. All right. Did everybody get that to work okay? Everybody's okay. Now, you should know that the stuff we're doing in the chapter right now is in essence your homework. So you may as well start doing your screenshots. I'm just giving you some advice. Of course, you can do them later. That's up to you. But we're going to move on to the next page. So the first thing that we did is we just took something that was already there, a very simple text message, and changed it. Okay, not a big deal. At this point, we are actually going to create a controller. And so we're going to learn how to do that particular task. So the way that we create a controller is by actually going to the controllers folder. I am closing my browser, though, and you notice how that stopped the internal web server from running. The book does talk about the internal web server. The one that runs with Visual Studio is called IIS Express, meaning it's built into the product. You can also use a regular IIS server. In fact, most Windows operating systems have it built in. Most users don't typically engage it, but that's something you should know. They have a little sidebar on it. That's why I thought I would mention it to you. All right, so for the next step, let's go ahead and create that new controller. And the way that we do that is just simply right-clicking on the controller folder, choose Add, And then notice right at the top, main choice is controller. All right. And then you will be presented with this next interface. So if you're looking at the instructions in the book, we are currently at the top of page 43. For right now, we're going to start with an empty controller. But I do want you to notice in this selection list that we have 3 MVC5 controller options here. Some of them have read-write actions attached to them. Some of them are attached to the entity framework. The entity framework is a tool that we use in Visual Studio to allow us to interface with data sources, most notably databases. Notice that the rest of these all refer to Web API, and we will do a little Web API before we get out of this course. I'm hoping we can get to more of it than we did this summer, so that's one of my wishes for the class, and hopefully that comes true. All right, so if you've got that selection chosen, the empty one at the top, go ahead and click Add. And then you'll get this dialog. And isn't this interesting what they do? Notice how part of the words inside the text box there are available for edit, and they don't want you to edit the controller part. They want you to leave that alone. Why? It's part of that convention over configuration concept. All controllers should be called controllers, is kind of their thinking. And you know, hey, that makes sense. So go ahead and change that now to say store. So the whole thing says store controller, capital S and capital C. Go ahead and click Add. Now notice what it says right here in the dialog. Scaffolding. So it's doing something in the background automatically. You'll notice in the folder now on the right-hand side, in the controllers folder, you do have a store controller C# file, and we see the contents of it up on the screen. By default, we have certain using statements that are automatically included, and these are automatically included in all ASP.NET projects, the top 3 or 4. Notice the one that's highlighted on line 5 says using system web.mvc, which is what gives us the ability to use all the MVC tools within the framework. Using statements in C# are like import statements in Java. The reason we use them is to bring outside resources into the project and to give us capabilities that we wouldn't have without. The other thing that's important to notice here is to take a look at line number 7. And notice this is kind of a weird construct, especially if you're coming from Java programming and maybe seeing this for the first time in C#, is this thing called a namespace. Very simply, folks, all a namespace is a container that's being named just so that you can uniquely identify the contents inside. Because notice on line 12, we have an index method. You know what? So did the home controller. By putting that inside the class file of store controller, it identifies that index method with that controller. But it's possible that you might have a project where you might have multiple store controllers. That sounds kind of weird, right? And the way that we ultimately end up identifying their uniqueness is through the namespace. So the namespace, in essence, is just a container that is named so that we can uniquely identify the contents, just in case they happen to be named identical to the contents of a different namespace. So it's just an encapsulation mechanism, a naming mechanism, if you will. On line number 9, notice the colon that sits in between store controller and controller. Does anybody remember what that colon is? It's okay. If you don't remember, I will tell you. One more time. 4. It's neither. It isn't. In C#, if you guys remember to Java, and I know, Tom, this will resonate with you because you're doing Java effects right now, right? And in Java effects, every time you write a GUI application, you said it, I think? No, it's not a constructor, but it indicates that you're extending a superclass, is what it does. So like when we do Java effects, we say whatever your application name is extends application, and it gives you access to all the tools that come with it. This is the same thing. So store controller, the colon implies extends the controller superclass. So we have a superclass that has all this functionality built in that we can just call upon. That's all that means. All right, so as simple as that was, we have created a controller. Very simplistic example. So in the next thing that we're going to do, now we're going to tweak the action methods that go inside the controllers. So controllers do their work via action methods. If you don't think in terms of methods, like if you're thinking maybe JavaScript instead of Java, right? A method is really the equivalent of a function. If you're thinking Visual Basic, it's the equivalent of a subroutine. So it's a named block of code that you can call. Those are called methods. In controllers, we call them action methods. This particular type of action method is an action result. There are a few different types, and the book does detail them. All right. Let's go down to the top of page 44 right now in Chapter 2. And inside this action method, we're going to make some tweaks. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change what I have highlighted right now, action result. We're going to change that to say string. All right. And then inside the curly braces, we're going to remove the view method and instead just put in a snippet of text. And we're just going to say hello from store.index. And close your double quotes. So all they're really doing here, and actually the book does this, but that's irrelevant. It's just text. What they're doing is they're trying to show you that when we fire up the application again, we are going to call upon, instead of home about, we are going to call on store, because it's the store controller, index, to bring up the view. And of course, if we call the default index, we don't even have to say index. We just call store, and the default action method is index. So that's the plan here. The other thing they want us to do is add a little bit more content inside here. And what they want you to do is add an additional method. In fact, they want you to add 2 additional methods. And if you wish, if you have the PDF copy of this text, you could copy the code in, or you could type it in. I'm going to, I guess, cheat a little bit and copy paste. I hope you don't mind. And if you do, too bad. And I'm just pasting it in. That actually pasted in pretty cleanly. So look at what I just added. And we're not worried about like action results right now. We're just making everything a string. So each one of these methods is a string method. That's the data type it's returning. We've got them each named. So one of them is called browse, and one of them is called details. Okay, pretty simple. Do a Control S to save your work. All right. Next thing that we're going to do is we are going to launch the application again, so let it come up in the browser. And let's bring it back over from the other screen. And then what they want us to do is navigate to each one of the things that we created. Now, here's a problem. We haven't added links to this on the site. About and contact, those were automatically created, right? Now we're creating a store page, and then we're going to create, store controller, and then we're going to access the methods within that controller. So here we go. To access the stuff that we just created, go to your address bar and just type in first store. Notice the capital S. just plain store. When I press enter on that, it brings back whatever the default method is for that controller. The default method for the store controller is index. In fact, it's the default method for all controllers. Okay, question, right? Maybe in your head. Do all controllers have to have an index? No. They do by default, though, right? And as a result, when I go to just store, I don't have to include after it index. However, I just typed it in and pressed enter, and it still takes me to the same place. So index is implied when it's not included. So this is equivalent to this. Make sense? And once again, what we're doing is we're calling the controller and then the method. Granted, we're just returning a string right now, very simple example, but conceptually important in terms of the URL and how the URL drives the controller and the application. Now let's try accessing the other stuff that we created. So instead of just straight up store or index, let's actually say browse and press enter. And then you'll see, why we put in the different text so that we can identify that it worked. So we did browse, and then we also need to try details. And all three of them worked successfully. All right, one thing that the book points out following this little exercise, I'm just going to bring it back so you can see where I'm at. So I'm going from the bottom of 44 over to 45. They are pointing out some of the things I've already pointed out. But look at bullet number 3 here at the bottom of the screen. It says, right now they're just returning a string. That is really not typical necessarily for a controller. Maybe, depending on what you're doing it is. But typically a controller will return a view. And that's why when we were looking at the home controller here, this is why we're returning a view. All right, we're back from our break, and we're going to continue now at the bottom of page 45. And this is what I'm looking at on my screen. I will be pulling it off to the side here and continue with the progress that we're making. So the author begins by saying to us that so far we've set it up to return strings basically as a constant. I mean, we're hard coding it, and it's coming back to the screen. But what if we want to add some dynamic capabilities to it? So that really is a matter of writing some programming code that's a little bit more robust than what we're doing so far. Now, one thing I'm noticing here, folks, and I had actually paused the video for a moment, but make sure that you hit the stop button on your application before you go trying to make any changes, because otherwise it will run into issues. So just keep that in mind. Now, the next thing that we need to do is to make an alteration to the browse method in order to be able to get some dynamic content coming up on the screen. Now, the question is, I look at my home controller and I don't see a browse method. Is there a browse method in the store controller? Yes. So that's where we want to do our edits. So in this particular method right here, we're going to change a couple of things. And I want you to notice in the book, the comment that's listed just before the method, they changed the text of it. And the reason that they're doing this is for demonstration. But notice, yeah, it gets redundant. I get it. But what they're showing you here is a different syntax. So watch what happens here. Notice that they're telling you on these comments what URL will respond to this method. But what we're showing now is not only store/browse, but question mark genre equals question mark disco. You can kind of guess what that is. But really what they're telling you to do is to narrow down the contents that might be returned to include only stuff that falls into the disco category. Now, in order to make that work, we also have to pass in a parameter here as a string, and the parameter we're going to pass in, we're going to call it genre. Okay? We're going to change the contents inside here, and I'm going to begin by just adding a couple of lines. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string variable. Just say string, I'm going to call it message, and then we're going to call upon a method here. And I'm actually typing this in on purpose because I want to show you the IntelliSense that's happening too if you happen to type it by hand. So we're going to use HTTP utility .html encode, and then we're going to say here store.browse. That's just text, folks. And then the genre equals, this is still all text, plus whatever it is we're passing to it in the form of taking that incoming argument or the parameter that was received and adding it, concatenating it to a string, and turning it into something that's encoded, notice, in HTML, so that we can then output it to the screen. So instead of returning a hard-coded text message, we are going to return a variable which will be a combination of hard-coded text and a parameter being passed in. Where are we passing the parameter in? That's the question you really need to ask yourself. The parameter will be passed from the URL. That's kind of the magic here. All right. Initially, we're not really doing anything with it. We're just sending it data, receiving the data, putting it in a variable, and putting it back up on the screen. But it shows you how the application works. That's really kind of the key takeaway here. The other thing that's important to know, and they make a little indication here at the top of page 46, the HTML encode basically allows you, in the author's words, to sanitize the user input and basically prevents people from injecting code into your application. So I want you to think about this, because what we're basically going to do is we are going to bring up the browser, we're going to type in the URL, controller name, method name, slash, passing it a parameter. It's going to receive the parameter, put it in a variable, and output it back to the screen to show us that it worked. All by virtue of throwing it into the URL. What a lot of crafty hackers have done in the past is they leverage applications that allow this kind of thing, and they append to the URL like a malicious script or SQL injection or something like that. The HTML encode prevents that from happening. So it's like a security feature. That's something you guys should know. So that's what that little blurb is at the top. So here we go. Let's go ahead and save this. Now I'm noticing that my return statement is underlining red. Can anybody tell me why without me hovering over it? What did I do wrong? You got it. Missing the semicolon. That's all it takes. Did you catch that too? Good. You guys are becoming well trained with that. All right, here we go. Let's launch again. Here it comes up on my second screen, of course. And then what we're going to do is we're going to type in the URL they show in step number 2 at the top of page 46. So I'm going to append to the URL store /browse, and then not another slash, but a question mark, and we're going to say genre equals disco. Now, this method of passing a parameter is in the form of what we call a get, meaning whenever you see that question mark in there, we're passing data in the form of a key value pair right through the URL. The key, or like, I want to think of it as the variable name, I guess, is genre. The data that we're sending is disco. So when I press enter, it will receive it into the store controller. It finds the browse method, receives the parameter being passed, stores it in a variable, prevents it from being injected with a script, and then returns it back to the screen so that we know that it worked, and it did. So here's an example of controlling an application through its controller and passing data directly to a method within a controller. Now granted, a regular user wouldn't know to type this in, right? This is more the point of, building the example and showing you how the technology works. Go ahead and close your browser again so the internal web server stops running. And now we're going to make an edit in step number 3 to the details method. And this, their example URL is this. This is in essence the same thing, but what's happening here is because this is a numeric parameter, I don't have to do the key value pair thing. I just directly send the data following the slash. I do need a way to receive the data, so here inside the parentheses, I am going to call data type integer. I'm going to call it ID, give it a name. And then inside here, I'm going to add a line. Once again, I'm going to create a string message. And now we're going to say store details, comma ID equals space, and then of course we're going to concatenate the ID that we're passing in and close it. Then of course, instead of returning hard-coded text, we're just going to return the variable we created. The key takeaway, one more time, folks, is the fact that we're going to be passing data into the parameter of this method, receiving it, storing it, and outputting it. Hit the play button and run the application. Once it comes up on your screen, be prepared to type in the revised URL. So now we're going to type in store details /5. That 5 at this point is passing value. You can see that the method received it and output it back to the screen. Received it here, stored it there, put it into the variable, and sent it back to the browser. Once again, simplistic example, but a powerful one in demonstrating how the technology works. Right, and I did have a question here in class to demonstrate the previous example again, which I'll do. So in this case, they wanted us to go to browse, and then we did genre disco. So let's change that to something else. Let's change that to, I don't know, give me a music format, jazz. Okay, country, fine. And then press enter. Yeah, it's a question mark. The question mark puts it in the form, once again, of a get. And really what's happening there is we're simulating how a Windows, or not a Windows form, but an HTML form works. So remember, if you do an HTML form and you fill out data and then you hit the button, the data gets passed to the subsequent script by virtue of a get, which is a question mark preceded by key value pairs in a repeating fashion. And what we want to look at now is kind of like the closing comments here on the chapter. So the author points out these 3 bullets, and I think some of these are kind of important concepts. That's why we kind of put them up on screen like this. One of the key takeaways here, folks, is the fact that the way that we type our URLs in an MVC application controls how we operate the application. Now, a user typically won't be going right to the address bar to make the application run. Usually they'll be clicking a link and they'll be programmatically rerouted to where they need to go. However, sometimes people do share links to applications, and even though the links do not represent the physical folders and file structure, because that's not how this technology works, it does point you to the controller, to its methods, and then also gives you the ability to pass parameters either as key value pairs or as a hard-coded parameter that you pass, like the number 5. The other thing that's kind of important here is that the stuff that we're putting on the screen, it says the fact that you'll almost always use views as templates to generate the strings, usually HTML. So right now we're just putting strings together. But when you're writing a real application that's going to a browser, chances are you're going to be injecting HTML into those outputs, or razor statements, which we'll learn later. All right. Notice additionally that 3rd bullet, they always talk about returning an action method, and in this case they're talking about action results, and it says it handles things such as status codes and view templating, etc. So there's really kind of a lot of capability here, and we very much scratch the surface, but still hit upon what I would consider some of the most important components of it, and that is how the URL routing works with the controllers, and how the controller has the capability of really controlling the whole application, kind of like the conductor in an orchestra. It receives whatever is coming in from the user, interprets it, sends it to the right spot, and then really it's a matter of programming logic in terms of what you're putting inside your methods to make things happen. And to me that's pretty powerful and kind of cool in many ways. All right, believe it or not, that wraps our chapter. We made it all the way through chapter 2, which is a great accomplishment. So we are done with chapter 2 for now, and this video ends here.